Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. With me today is a returnee. He obviously enjoyed it so much. He agreed to come back again. But I have John Gruder. So John, as you remember, did a brilliant episode all about leadership with some top tips on how to engage your team and to drive that relationship with your individuals within your finance team. He is the assistant professor of organization behavior, if I can get my mouth around saying that, at Maynooth University, which is the National University of Ireland. So thank you very much for coming back on the show, John. Great to have you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me again, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, one of the big reasons I asked you to come back on the show was that we got so caught up with describing relationships between leadership and their
Yeah,
followers that we didn't quite get onto the topic that we were hoping to cover last time, which is all about how do we manage lead, or how do we lead during change, volatility, and challenging circumstances, because obviously there is a lot of that happening right now, and we're
yeah.
about to potentially hit a wave of that based on the economic forecast. So
Mhm.
can we maybe start with understanding how relationships change during a crisis or volatility? What happens and why are those relationships so important?
Yeah, certainly. Let's say there are two levels that might be important to mention here. So one, the organizational level and how organizations change, and how leaders change within organizations as to their managing their staff and the type of process that change there. So the organizational level and the leadership level. What tends to happen during any sort of crisis, and a crisis is defined as something that the organization or the people high up in the organization see as something probably troubling. I mean, as in potentially coming soon. It doesn't have to be in full swing already. And that can be anything. It can be a post on social media that was, ill received. It wasn't received as intended. Maybe the company made a mistake and they posted something to apologize. We just actually literally 2 or 3 days ago had a paper accepted on this very topic. So, that can go horribly wrong, unintentionally so, and that can cause a crisis in quotation marks, as in it is something that the public certainly will see and they will pay attention to it, and organizations tend to then start shuffling around and seeing, okay, what caused the problem and how can we prevent this from ever happening again. Now, that's a very small, let's say, crisis, but of course, there's also much larger ones like COVID, like any sort of merger and acquisition is usually an organization goes through a crisis through that period. It's a very volatile period. It's a period of, do we have to adjust to them or do they have to adjust to us in terms of culture? And the smart organizations, they know this, and they leave whenever a company acquires another company. They leave that company alone, at least at the beginning. So they leave them relatively independently. Like, okay, you continue doing what you're doing, and slowly we'll transition you guys into the parent company. So what tends to happen during a crisis is that management and leaders tend to centralize power. So whatever power was uh, delegated beforehand to subsidiaries or to regional managers, that power then gets taken away and gets centralized, and headquarters is then a very small team, a core team that tends to make these decisions as long as the crisis period lasts. And it can be relatively short, or it can be indeed several months or even years during COVID. And that's a very natural response. I mean, if you think about the very, very old organizations, going back to, let's say, the Roman Empire, okay, they had a Caesar who was appointed for 4 years during times of war, and obviously war is a volatile time, and that was done on purpose because you need to be able to make decisions quickly and without too much having to discuss with others, without having to seek consensus on every single step that you take. So you have to have somebody who is in a power position who can actually make decisions and implement them quickly. The problem, of course, with that is that just like with Caesar's appointed back in time, they didn't want to leave those positions of power after the 4 years that they were in power. And so that can be an issue, much more so in organizations who, of course, don't have a limitation, as many countries do, with regard to elected officials, with regard to how long can they actually stay in power. And we have a few examples of organizations where the current CEO, has been the same person, the same CEO as at the very, very beginning of the company, or at least for many, many years. And that can be an issue because there's only so many times you can reinvent yourself and your firm and still come across as authentic. So I don't know if I completely went off on a tangent there, but there's a lot to talk about when it comes to a crisis. So on the organizational level, there's centralization, and on the leader-follower level, it becomes more, let's say, managerial, more transactional, and especially in a time of crisis, it's actually really important. I don't want it to come across as something negative. Transactional leadership is something very important as well. I mean, we think of a leader as somebody who is, the usual charismatic, inspirational, confident. But during a crisis, you don't want someone who is taking risks unnecessarily. You want somebody who can provide people structure, can say, okay, this is a problem, this is a crisis. We know you're all worried. Here's what you need to do, and here's what you can do. So I'm giving you structure. Here's your task. Focus on this, and we will get through it. And giving people structure and giving them instructions as to what it is that they can do really instills a lot of confidence in them that they will get through this, and that the company is doing, or the manager in this case, is doing the best that they can. So that's the type of leader you want through a crisis. You don't want someone to say, let's imagine this better future and we can all work towards it. This is a crisis. Like, let's talk about that once we're through this crisis. Let's just get through it first. And having someone who's really inspirational and really charismatic and so on in that particular moment might actually backfire. So you don't want to take on unnecessary risks, new ways of doing something. Stick with what you know works. Do that well. Focus on your tasks. Get through the period, that transition period. Hopefully it won't last too long. And whatever the fallout may be, we'll pick up the pieces and continue from there. So you want somebody who can give people that structure and who fully displays that this is an actual worry. This is not something that we can take really easily, because otherwise it wouldn't be a crisis, and otherwise you wouldn't have people worrying already. You wouldn't have employees who are maybe questioning their future within the firm, because who knows, depending on how bad the crisis is, there might not be a firm left. So.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So I think what you're saying there is, firstly, the approach needs to be a lot more hands-on when you're going through a crisis, and that it needs to be more directive in terms of a leadership style versus consultative and giving more autonomy. So you're basically pulling the direction back in rather than delegating authority and autonomy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And obviously, we talked a lot about leadership, and one of the key drivers behind motivation is, or in a lot of cases, is autonomy. From what we talked about and what I've read. So, how do you balance the motivation aspect and keeping people engaged and feeling like they're developing when you've got that kind of crisis environment?
So, let's take a step back from this and first define the role of motivation. I don't want to come across as too much of a professor here, but it is important to understand that motivation is certainly a very important part of performance, which is what we are aiming for when it comes to anything work related, really. But it is not the only part of performance. So if you think about motivation predicts performance, that's correct, and autonomy is a very big part of motivation. Mastery is another part, that you like to do things that you're good at and you like to improve in whatever you're doing, and so you keep doing it because it brings you joy, and you start getting better, because whatever you do for a longer period of time, you get better at it. But the other part is, the other predictor of performance is talent or skill, let's call it. So it doesn't really matter how motivated I am. I will never be playing in the NBA. That's never going to happen, right? So not just because I lack the height, I imagine, but also other, let's say, more fitness-related aspects that it's just not going to happen. And now, lucky for me, that was never a quest of mine. But in any case, I know that there's a limitation there. So the the conception that motivation is the most important part to get to performance, it's just incomplete. It's not incorrect, but it's just incomplete. You do need to ensure that people have the right talent, skills, competences, whatever it is that you want to call it, because otherwise they are not going to be able to perform, even if they were highly motivated. Even if you motivate them to perform, they're not going to be able to make it through that. So there's two. Let me just say one more thing on this, and then we'll move on to what you can do as a leader. There's a very famous book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, which you might have mentioned on the show. I don't know, but it's this misconception that this 10,000 hour rule that people might have heard about. So the 10,000 hour rule is essentially, and I remember listening to that book when it came out a long time ago, that they did this study, and I think it was a New York orchestra or something like that, where they had these extremely talented people, and they figured that on average, people who worked there, high performers, super talented people, had practiced about 10,000 hours. First of all, that was wrong, and second of all, the misconception from that, the misinterpretation by Malcolm Gladwell, who later on said, yeah, okay, that was not interpreted right, and also the authors of that study came out and said, wait a second, that's not what we said. Well, the misinterpretation was that you can do anything you want as long as you put in 10,000 hours, you're an expert. That's right. So again, I'm going back to the NBA example. I did play basketball there for a short stint in my life for about 2 years. Wasn't the best period for myself or the team. But in any case, so that's not going to be it. Like, even if I were to practice that for 10,000 hours, I'm not going to be an expert at it necessarily. I might have a talent for it, and so yes, of course, practice makes better, but practice doesn't actually make perfect. You do need that other component, which is talent, skill, competence. So the original study, first of all, found that it was roughly 7,500 hours, and it was on average. And an average means 50% above, 50% below. So there's a lot of people there who had studied way less than 7,000 hours, who had practiced, way less than 7,000 hours, and were there. They were, in that orchestra. There are other people who had studied way more than 7,000 hours, but of course, 7,500 sounds like an uneven number, and it is. So let's make it 10, and move on. So that was the first misconception, and the other one is that we just don't necessarily, we can't expect to be great at something just because we're motivated, right? So just because we put in the work, we put in the practice or studying or whatever it is. So going back to our example with regard to leaders and followers through a crisis, if you are in a crisis situation as a manager, as a leader, first of all, check, make sure that the people that are working in your team have what they need to succeed. I'm not talking about motivation, I'm talking about skills, competences, have they received the right training? And the answer usually is not entirely, because you are in a crisis and you wouldn't necessarily be in that bad of a position if they would have had what they need to begin with. It can be resources, but most of the time it has to do more with qualifications and training that you should be providing as an organization, as a manager. So that's the first thing to focus on. And when you are in a situation where you realize that they don't have what it takes to get us through this, it's not their fault. It's our fault because we didn't provide them what they needed, earlier on, so that they can be prepared for a situation like this. Then you need to hire outside, consultants or whatever it is. Consultants could be good for a short period of time, extremely expensive, but you can get them on the short term. You can also buy in talent that will take a while though for them to fully get settled and so on. And that gives you a window of opportunity to train your staff so that they can be better prepared for, the next situation that will arise, or certainly those same competences, crisis management, leadership competences, whatever it is, will actually be very much applicable. So that's how I would advise managers to look at the situation, right? So don't just focus on motivation. Motivation is hardly ever in a crisis the issue, because people are motivated to get through it. People are certainly motivated to keep their jobs. So that's not going to be that much of an issue. What is going to be an issue is guidance, direction, and do we have what we need to succeed? But it's not something that you need to just worry about during a crisis or for a crisis situation. You should be thinking about this, all year long, basically. So reassessing on a continuous basis, do our employees, do our staff have what they need to be successful, to meet the expectations we set for them? That's very much key.
That's really interesting, and I think some fast. So for those that might be going through, like you say, a challenging time, whether it's finance related or not, there's some great tips in that. And
Yeah.
how do those relationships differ when we talk about change and transformation? Because we talked about how those relationships look or what changes during a crisis.
Yeah.
How does it work within change and transformation? Is it any different, or what's the
So
setup?
it's a good question. It really depends on how we define change, and as an individual, I mean, as an employee, and then of course as a leader as well. Leaders are employees too, of course. So the issue that people seem to have with change, and when I say people, I include very much myself, a human being with change, is that change usually has a negative connotation. It's like, I don't want change, but it's being forced upon me, which is very interesting to think about because, of course, we go through many changes in life, right? Both professionally and as well personally. I mean, if you think about, outside of the workplace for a second, most people decide who they marry, right? That's a huge change. I mean, that's probably the most important decision that you will be making in terms of that will have the greatest impact on your life. That and having children. And of course, that's another example. You decide to have a child, that's a change. But we don't see it as change necessarily. We see it as a choice. So that's the difference in terms of perception. When somebody tells you, this is what's going to happen, we're going to have 2 more people join the team, all right? And you're going to be in charge of training them. Nobody wants that, right? Like, that's extra work. Why do I need to be the person to do this? I already have a job. I already have loads of assignments and things that I need to take care of. Yeah, that's a change, as in it's perceived as you now have to do this, although I know you don't want to, probably. But it's interesting because you could see it as a choice. You could see it as, oh, okay, so this is an opportunity for myself to, teach others, to train others, to potentially, hopefully, not make the same mistakes I made, or at the very least, you can help them transition more easily, more smoothly into the organization. And that is probably something they're going to be very thankful for to you, which might come in handy later on. Even if you don't think about it altruistically, think about it, okay, what can I get out of this? It still comes up as a benefit. So that's something really important to distinguish. Essentially, any change can be perceived as a choice, or rather, let me put it this way, a choice is a change as well, but it's not something that we see necessarily as negative. So with regard to how leader-follower relationships change or differ during times of change, and I would say a time of change certainly can be perceived as like a mini crisis for individuals. And so people are likely going to react the same way as if it were a more major, like a crisis that impacts several individuals at once, be it a team, an organization, or countries during the pandemic. So the reaction will probably be quite similar because it's something that I don't necessarily want. I see it as change. People don't like change in general. That's not something that we, as human beings, we appreciate consciously. But of course, it is something very much necessary because without change, we wouldn't be here today. Like we wouldn't, we make decisions that change the course of our professional lives all the time. And that can be something small, like what you say in a meeting, or something a little bit more impactful, what you say during an interview, right? And that gets you the job that you want, the position that you wanted, or the promotion, or whatever it is. So we make loads of decisions on a day-to-day basis, and each of those potentially carries an element of change, but it's not an element of change that we see as something negative. And we see it as a choice because I said this in order to, get this job, or I want to present myself the best possible way. And so I did, and it got me this promotion, right? So not sure if I answered the question at all, but in any case, I do think that there's a lot to say about change and about how we perceive it. And leaders need to realize that, first of all, any sort of change initiative that is not coming from employees themselves, like internally within the organization, is not going to be appreciated, period. Second, then your job becomes, okay, how can I make sure that the positives of this upcoming change initiative, and it can be something really small, it can be something like something that like updating the software or the process that you use to claim expenses. Okay, like it's not going to change the course of the strategic alignment of the organization and none of that. But it's going to be potentially super annoying to people because, especially people who just joined the organization a year ago, they got trained with this existing system. Now you got a new one. Here we go again. I have to, go through a few hours of training in order to make sense of this. And I really don't want to do it. But of course, I want my money back. I don't want to claim my expenses. So it's going to be potentially quite frustrating for people. So you need to highlight the positives of that. And there should be. If you can't find any positives, then this is not a change worthwhile doing. I mean, you should stop it, right? As a manager, you should be the one to say, we're okay with the way things are. We don't really see the benefit in this, new change that the organization, that might be coming from higher up, might be proposing. So the role of a manager in this case is twofold. One, to explain change initiatives from how does it impact your employees? What is in it for them? That's your job to explain, and the positives of that. And the second thing is, if it's not a good change effort, you should try to block it because it's going to be detrimental to your team dynamic. It's not going to make anyone happier. So what is the point? If there is no clear benefit from this, then maybe you should be the one to bring it up again, potentially with top management to say, do we really need this? All right. So, and I think the second part is oftentimes overlooked in terms of managerial responsibilities.
And there's an interesting piece, isn't there, in that sometimes having an impact in one area, like if we think about, changing software, for instance, it could be that actually for your team, it could be a negative impact because it could mean more automation, which might mean that you don't need as many people. Something that, like you say, could be seen, could be a negative. If we just use your terminology, it could be a negative piece. For those individuals that are within that team, but actually the overall benefit and the cost benefit to the organization is of a benefit. So how do you handle it whereby your team might be adversely impacted, but the wider organization there is a massive benefit for? So how do you sort of manage that in a way that I guess supports that change?
Yeah, so it would be what I was saying earlier. It's going to be probably a little bit more challenging in that case. But if there is a cost benefit to the organization in terms of automated processes, first of all, automated processes are hardly ever completely automated from the get-go. I wish they were. We all wish they were. But there's going to be some, I think they call it teething issues or whatever it is at the beginning. So here's this new great system. It's going to make all of our lives easier, right? Because it's automated. It's probably going to have loads of technical issues, even if it's been pre-tested 1,000 times. Once it's implemented for that many people, there's going to be issues. People will feel frustrated. Not everybody, of course, and hopefully it's only a small, like a handful of people, but that handful can be quite destructive in terms of how the perception of this new system goes about. So what is important is if there are any cost benefits to the organization that are clear to people that, okay, we're doing this because it saves money, where is that money going? Show me the money, right? So where is the money going, as in can we potentially benefit from this as a team in terms of budget for next year or for the next project, or more autonomy or more flexibility? Like, there has to be something that you see as a benefit from this. So, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to implement this new system. We don't really want to, we don't really see the point for us personally, but we understand it's a organization-wide initiative and it's going to save money. Great, but what is in it for me as a team, as a unit, as a department? And I think that is then the responsibility both of the heads of department or the team leader and the people who are actually deciding on, this is going to save us X amount of money. How is this? Where is this money going? Like, how is it going to be distributed? Now, most organizations, let's be fair, are not super transparent in terms of how much they pay their, top managers. You probably know how much your CEO can make within the firm, because if it's a large firm, everybody knows, because that's what the media talks about. But in small organizations like SMEs, you have, let's say, 100 people or so, 150 people, you might not know how much money, salary-wise, your top directors are making, and that's fine. I'm not saying that you should tell people, oh, all this money that we're saving, we're going to give to a bonus to CEO and CFO for their great work. Don't do that. But what you should be doing is you should be telling people, okay, so a small part of this money that we're saving is going to go towards X. And whatever X is, it better be something that people actually care about. So it doesn't have to be salary, it doesn't have to be a bonus, like an individual employee bonus or salary, but it can be something like more autonomy on the next project, or it can be a larger budget, or it can be some sort of seed funding that we're going to have for interesting ideas, and designing a pilot study around that and see if it works. Because those are really important. If you have a company where employees feel like they can bring up a disagreement, where they can feel like they're safe, psychologically safe enough to say, I think we can do this better. Those are potential cost-saving projects, right? And you should be looking actively to fund those and to encourage them. Not just encourage and say, well, we don't have any funds, so good luck with it, but really, be able to fund them. And it doesn't, need a lot of money, but that is something that can be certainly done within the organization, or it can be something as simple as you have an idea, we're implementing this initiative because it's going to save us costs. Some of that money is going to go towards funding interesting ideas like the one you have. And that can mean that, you will be doing less work in terms of what you have been doing so far. So you have some extra time to work on this new idea that you might have had that can also potentially be a contribution to the firm. So try to see it as, it's a give and take. So if you're going to take something from them, which in this case is time, you better have something to give to them, because this can fly. If you don't do anything, if you don't give them anything, this can probably fly very well in the short term. But people who are talented, people who know that they're talented, they're not going to stay with you for very long if you keep doing this, because they know they can go somewhere else. And why not go somewhere where my ideas are appreciated, or, when I'm being asked to do something, it is explained to me how it has a direct effect on me, or even indirect, but in any case, there should be an explanation. So don't ever just make a decision and communicate to people without an explanation. It's almost 100% guarantee that people will resist.
And obviously, when you're working with a team, have you got any thoughts about whether it's best to have those conversations as a group, as individually? How do you get everybody understanding and believing in the reason why you're doing it? What's the best way to approach it?
The best way to approach it, there should be a communication, obviously, that goes to everyone. That can be a team meeting. But then everyone should have the opportunity, individually, to write down their thoughts on that, bullet points, anonymously. As in, you're not going to be identifiable based on what you write. You can do this online, you can do this just a piece of paper and a pen. surprisingly works well here too. And then you collect those ideas, and then you see, okay, so what's the frequency of the same point coming up again and again by the group? The reason why I say this is because we have to be aware, and I think most managers of team leaders, let's call them, are aware of biases when it comes to groups and groupthink. When you just go along with what the group thinks, even though you might disagree, even though you know what they're about to decide is wrong, you go along because you don't want to cause conflict, because you don't want to be the one to, rattle the cage, so to speak, and you don't want to be ostracized from the group, by doing so. So you're not going to say anything. But this is exactly what leads teams to make really stupid decisions. Even good teams. So even teams, and those are the most interesting for us to study, right? You have a great team. You have a team that has high commitment, high understanding. They're really there for each other. They jump in if someone is sick or, whatever it is going on. They do each other's work when necessary. It's a true unit. And even in those teams where you would expect they make great decisions all the time, or at least the vast majority of the time, once you have team bias, groupthink, escalation of commitment, can be many different kind of biases, you might have a very bad decision on your hand that the group will stand behind because it's their decision. What else can they do? So it's really important. It's crucial, in fact, not just for change, but for any sort of group decision that you have to make or to try to find a consensus, is to allow individuals within the team to actually write down their thoughts and anonymously, and so that they will not be ostracized from the rest of the group. There's a great experiment that was done back in the 50s, which is surprisingly simple, and I don't know if we have enough time to talk about that, but it's okay. So it's very surprisingly simple. So basically, you had participants come in with one participant at a time in a room, and 6 what we call confederates in psychology research, which are essentially individuals who know what the experiment is about. They've been told what to say and when to say it, and essentially you can think of them like actors. Okay, so you have 6 of these actors, and you have one participant sitting in one line, in a row, and then the experimenter talks about the task. The task is surprisingly simple. It's a card with a line on it. Let's call that line X, and another card with 3 lines on it, A, B, and C. The task is very simple. Which line, A, B, or C, is as long as line X? Okay, and it's not a trick question. It is very obvious what the right answer is. Okay, now what happens is that each of the confederates goes, and says their answer in a row. So the confederate 1 says, it's A. Let's assume A is the right one, and they all say A, and then participant, that's the only one that we're actually paying attention to. What do they say? And they say A. They go with the rest of the group. It's clearly the right answer. After a few rounds of this, of saying the right answer, they start saying the wrong answer on purpose. Okay, so the confederates are saying it's clearly B, and you see it if you go on YouTube, you can find it. Just type in ASH study, ASH study, and you will find it. They start saying the wrong answer on purpose, and then the question is, does the participant conform to the rest of the group, even though they know it's wrong? And in the majority of cases, they conform at least sometimes. Okay, not all the time, but sometimes. Some individuals never conform. Okay, so someone like, well, these people must be stupid because clearly it's not B, it's A, right? It's very obvious. But the vast majority of people conform at least some of the time. Some people conform all the time. So you're going to have these individuals in your group. I mean, I think this was done with students back in the day, but it's been repeated since, and we know that this is the case, that people do conform to the group. These are people you don't know, right? These are not your friends. These are not important. These are not family members. These are not your team members. You don't work with these individuals. They're just some random people who came to the experiment, right? And yet, it's seen as a group. It's seen as, I need to fit in. And, the reason for this is because, evolutionary speaking, group means safety. Group means protection. from outside threats, but also it means access to resources. So imagine how much stronger this effect is when you're in a work environment where you have these individuals in your team that you have worked with before and that you don't want to ruin relationships with because you're likely going to be working with them again. So you have a very strong incentive to conform to the group, even though you might think or you might know that the group is wrong. And the answers of the participants, why did you conform? Quite interesting. Some of them said, well, there's 6 of them and 1 of me. And if they all think it's B, maybe there's something wrong with my eyes and maybe it's me. They're the majority. They should be right. Or in other times, like I said earlier, they know they're saying the wrong answer. But why should I be the one to bring this up? I don't want conflict. I don't want, I don't want these people to hate me. Again, you don't know these people. Why do you care? But we care because we're humans and we're social creatures. So the one way of getting around this, and they had this in the experiment condition as well, where the participant was told to come in later. And they came in late and they told, well, you're late, so you need to write down your answers on a piece of paper. Instead of saying them out loud, the group already did the task. So just write down they would not conform because it's written down. I don't have to face the criticism of these individuals. Again, that I don't know. But imagine how much stronger the effect is of people that you do know. And that's why also, by the way, brainstorming is a horrible idea. I mean, it's a nightmare. Like this idea that no idea is a bad idea. No, there's plenty of bad ideas. Okay, let's just say it. Most ideas are bad, or let's say most ideas are not the best, right? So instead of doing that, just have people write it down individually. Okay, and there's a lot to say about you write down individually. You're protected from potential ostracism by the group, but also it helps with regard to creativity. If you have a room of people, individuals, that are given a task and have to come up with as many creative solutions to this task as possible, individually write it down on a piece of paper, and let's say there's 10 of those individuals. They're all working independently. And then you got 10 people in a team doing the same task, come up with as many creative solutions to this task as possible. Who do you think has the more creative ideas? Is it the team with 10 people that are discussing, they're sharing, communicating, or is it those 10 individuals who are working with a piece of paper and a pen by themselves? And the answer might be surprising. It's the individuals. Okay, because of team biases. It's not because teams are as a construct are bad and we don't like working with people. No, we love working with people. In fact, that's one of the number one reasons why people stay in jobs that are not that great. It's because their colleagues are nice. They feel like it's a good working environment, right? There might not be many opportunities for career advancement or whatever it is, but there is a great working culture, and that's really key. And that can keep people in jobs for a very long time. So we know that people love people, as in people. I mean, people don't love people, but people, like working with others in general. And it's not just because a team can get more done as an individual, just because there's more of them. But it's also because when you're in a team, you are less likely to speak up against bad ideas, or you're less likely to potentially even voice your own idea, which might be different because, someone else said something similar, so why should I just repeat that? But it might be different enough to be a separate idea. And that's the issue that leaders have to overcome. So first of all, they have to be aware of it. And then second of all, they have to come up with processes to overcome that bias, at least somewhat. And I think writing it down individually, anonymously, I think is a very easy way to get around this.
Now, I love that. So I was taught to brainstorm by putting things on paper, bringing people together to discuss those ideas, and then going back to then put more things on paper. So I was taught that is the way to brainstorm for exactly that reason, in that you can quite easily have a dominant voice in the conversation that drives something. Yeah. And like you say, it may not always be the best idea or approach to take, but they override for various reasons. They're the loudest, or it could be their seen as the leader within the group.
Yeah, and that's actually, that's another interesting point, that which we hadn't talked about, is this dominant character that you might have in a group that just takes over control of the entire meeting. And those people tend to be very extroverted. They also oftentimes tend to be a bit narcissistic. And when I say a bit, I don't mean just necessarily a bit. And that's what you can shut down really great ideas, because this person is talking all the time. So I'm not going to have an opportunity to actually speak up and say what I think. And then, of course, not every idea is good, but that can also mean that people dismiss really good ideas fairly quickly because of who it comes from as well. So if it's somebody who is perhaps a bit less extroverted, doesn't oftentimes speak up, but is a good employee, as in their performance is good and everything else, their clients like them and their work, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the one to. It's going to take a lot of effort for them to actively speak up and say that here's something we haven't considered. And that's why it's so important for leaders to create a climate in which, or even further than the climate, a culture, work organizational culture in which that is very much encouraged, that people speak up and people feel safe enough to speak up. It's something that I tell my students all the time, especially with executives that I teach, is they all talk about, if I tell them, okay, what are your experiences in teams? And they have loads of experience, 20, 30 years. And they all the time talk about conflict, right? So it's the team, and two of these people didn't get along, and it became a whole thing, and it took months to sort out. But what I need them to realize, and I think they do after the class is over, is that conflict is an absolutely necessary step to get to commitment. If you don't have conflict in a team, you don't really have a team, because conflict means that people care enough. I mean, there's two types of conflict: relationship conflict and task conflict. I'm talking about task conflict now. So if I disagree with, the best way forward, right, and I say something about it and say, I don't think, we're doing this right. I think we should do it this other way. That means that I, care enough about the work to say something, because I wouldn't say anything I frankly don't really care, so you can do whatever you want, and I'm just going to go along with it. I care enough to say something. And B, I want what's best for the team in terms of the decision that we make. So that's a positive. If you don't have conflict, you don't have disagreement, you have people that don't care, essentially. Or you have people that all think the same, like very homogenous group. And if you look at the boardrooms of many organizations, it becomes really clear, why sometimes organizations take the decisions they take, and why didn't anyone say anything? Like, this is just, there's so many examples of companies making even like marketing campaigns or something, and they go up in flames because why didn't anyone stop these people from making this stupid decision? Like, it's clear to anybody, right, the public, that this was wrong. Well, because if you have a room of 10 people and they're all the similar age, same sex, same socioeconomic background, went to the same university, or same type of university, then what do you expect to get, right? So it's very important that when we talk about teams, we need to talk about diversity, obviously, as well. And diversity means you have more people with different perspectives, more people to potentially stop you from making a stupid decision. At the same time, it means it will take longer to make a decision. So going back to that, talking about change earlier, if you have a homogeneous group of people, they're going to make decisions in no time. It's going to be very fast because people will agree quickly because they think the same or they think very similarly. But people who are from different backgrounds, and you don't have to have diversity solely in terms of sex, gender, and religious orientation or whatever it is. It's all about just people who think differently, who have had different sorts of lives, and who've overcome different kinds of obstacles and challenges in their life. Those are the people that think differently than a group of people that have had pretty similar experiences. So you need individuals who not only have had a different background, but also then you have to create an environment in which they feel free to actually speak up and challenge what is the status quo, or what the group thinks we should be doing next.
So I think with a lot of organizations, they're almost in some ways scared to ask for feedback and thoughts because they're worried what they're going to get back, as in they may come back with something that whilst they acknowledge, they can't address and can't deal with. So are there any strategies, like how do you manage that? Is it an acknowledgement enough of that is a challenge, but it's outweighed by this? Or, without disenfranchising the individual that put that thought forwards?
So you're saying in terms of how to deal with the feedback that organizations receive?
Yeah. So, for example, you put out. So, what are your thoughts on this project? And they get a long list of anonymous feedback, from individuals, but actually some of it isn't either valid, so it's not appropriate, or it's outweighed by the benefits. So, isn't it? How do you deal with that in a way that allows the individual that gave that feedback to feel like they're heard, but it doesn't necessarily stop what you're going to do, if that makes sense?
Right. Okay. So then this goes back to what we were discussing earlier with regard to explanation, right? Do I owe individual employees an explanation as an organization? I've asked them for feedback. I get the feedback. And of course, I completely agree with you that there's going to be plenty of feedback, which is going to be impossible to implement. I mean, let's just be frank, right? And for many reasons, but mostly has to do with resourcing and staffing, just limitations in general. All right. I mean, this is to be expected, right? I'd say maybe 80% of the things that people will say, well, we should get paid more. Okay. We should have, smaller teams. Like we're working in like 10 people teams. It's too many people. There's many things that just you're limited. Now the question is, do you owe people an explanation? I don't think you owe people an explanation to every single idea that is presented, but it might be the right thing to do. So obviously you don't know who the person is that actually gave you that feedback, if it's truly anonymous. And you better make sure it's anonymous, by the way. So if you send out a survey, which, I mean, we can talk about, that's probably a separate episode, if you just talk about surveys and collecting data and done horribly wrong, and not just organizations, but not just corporations, but any sort of organization, NGO, whatever it is, university including. The way that we collect information, airlines, same thing, right? Is just not adequate. It's just like, here's a scale from 1 to 5 and rate it, but it doesn't tell me why it was bad. Why was this experience bad for you? Let's say rate your team experience in the last project 1 to 5. I rated a 3. Okay, so what do you do with that information? Nothing. Like, it tells you nothing. So you need people to actually give you your words and explain, well, this is what went wrong and this is why I gave that rating. So that means keeping surveys extremely short and really focused on only what you really absolutely need, giving them an extra, like a text box to fill in their response. Most people won't, but some will. And you better make it anonymous. So don't make it with Microsoft Forms or whatever it is, where at the top it will say the survey creator will see your name. No, because then people will not give you their actual truth. People might not give you their actual truth, even if you make it anonymous, but you should really not, discourage them from the get-go, right? So that's something really important. Now, having dealt with that very briefly in terms of data collection, now you have this information. I think what you can certainly do is compose an FAQ if you want. Just have feedback and then have a response to it. And you can say something can be extremely short. And you can say something like, this doesn't, thank you for the suggestion, but this won't work because of limitations, resource staffing, yada, yada. And maybe refer to, maybe there's a policy on that will go against policy or something like this. You can refer to that for extra information. I think that will be incredibly not useful for employees necessarily. Most people, again, won't care, but it will really help you manage potential resistance from people. Well, they asked me for my ideas, I gave them my ideas, and they went with something else. But look, here is why we went with something else. And please keep sending us your ideas going forward. And this is something that we do a lot in research. We have to do it. It's not really a choice. where you work on something, you send it to an academic journal, you get feedback, which, listen, you ask for the feedback, right? It's gonna be, sometimes it can be extremely excruciating feedback, like this is wrong, this is horrible, yada yada. But they tell you, at least the good ones, tell you why it's wrong, why it doesn't work. And if you get a chance to respond to those comments, which is what we're saying here, like that's your chance to respond. The FAQ is the response from the organization to the employee. You can explain why. Why did you implement the decisions that you did in the way that you did? And there was during COVID-19, during the pandemic, because COVID-19 is of course still very much with us. We during the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, it was an absolute nightmare, right? Because you had new rules on a weekly basis, if not even before. And I mean, like travel rules, right? For example, or can you go to the barber or can you not go to the barber? This is a grand example of, we implemented something, and whatever policy was at the time, and the answer, to be fair, that was given, or the reason why it was implemented it was very short, let's say, and in my opinion, inadequate. So obviously, we understand at the very beginning it was a complete chaos. No one really knew what this was, and people thought they're going to be back in the office in 2 weeks. But as the crisis continued, and I'm talking about 2021 now, they knew about, COVID now, and we had vaccines. They were starting. There was a hope, and a lot of governments kept doing this. They kept changing rules, maybe not every week, but relatively frequently enough where you start wondering, why are we doing it this way? Why not? And it was very interesting to me because I was reading both Irish news and German news, which is what I do periodically, and their response was very different in many different cases, many different points through this crisis. And a lot of my friends who also live abroad, they're reading their home country news, and they were reading the news of the country that they're in. And even between countries that are very close to each other, like if you look at Ireland and the UK, or if you look at Germany and Austria, there were great differences at different points in time where you would read this news, both of them, and you would associate with one more than the other. You're like, why is this country doing it so wrong? Look at what the other countries are doing, right? So, and it went back and forth. This is not to say that one country had the right response all the time. Of course not. But the point is that this information is out there. There are different ways of doing it. There are different ways of implementing decisions. So, why didn't you consider this other decision in your neighboring country that people might have been more appreciative of, because they would understand it better? Not because it's better for them necessarily, but because they would understand there was an explanation. So I think that's really, really crucial. And when you're going through a crisis like the pandemic, obviously something we've never seen before, and I hope we don't in our lifetime at least. But the point is that there was a lot to learn, in terms of how do we implement decisions, and how do we tell people about them and give them an explanation. At the beginning, no explanation was needed because we don't even know what we're dealing with. But after a while, 6, 7, 8 months in, you should know what you're doing at this stage. So like we certainly knew the effect the virus had. There were different variants, yes, different impact on different groups of population. But by that point in time, people knew what they were dealing with relatively, right? And again, we had the beginning of the vaccination process was starting, and so there was hope. And still, there were policies implemented with an inadequate explanation many times, very abruptly. This is not how to gain the trust of, in this case, your followers, but it can apply to any organization. Like I said, that the government is an organization in and of itself as well. So I think there's a lot of lessons from the crisis that organizations can learn, and some organizations did a much better job overall. But at least at some point during the crisis, every organization probably went through, yeah, we could have done that a lot better.
So I'm very aware that we're getting to the end of this podcast. So if you had to summarize in a couple of different points, key things that leaders should do during a change to make it as impactful as possible and to achieve its aims, what are the key things that you think every leader should think about before they start change?
Right. So, first point, I would say, as a leader, if you have to implement a change, explain to people what is in it for them. All right. So, what is in it for you if you, help us implement this as intended? There might not be something short term. There might be something long term. What is it that you can get out of it? Second of all, when you make decisions in a leadership position, that means you have made decisions that will exclude certain other possible decisions you could have made, kind of like your opportunity cost in economic terms. You need to give people an explanation as to why is this the best way forward, and why are the other ones, A, B, C, D, that specific, these ideas not possible to implement, albeit they might be really good. And the third one is try your very best to not reflect, but display the change as something that's not negative, but actually that it's a choice, and to explain why was this choice made. So try to change the perception that people have of change, and try to frame it, that was the word I was looking for, as an actual choice. It's not a choice that they might make necessarily themselves. Someone else had to make that choice. But this is why, and this is what you might be getting out of it. Short term, long term, whatever it is. So that kind of brings it all, full circle.
I think that's a great summary. So thank you so much, John, and some great insight. And every time we have a podcast, I learn something new, which is fabulous. So
that's very good. Yeah. Me too, actually. The more you talk about something, the more you think about it, you start reflecting, and you try to think about, okay, how can I explain this better? And so I very much appreciate the opportunity, Hannah, to be on the podcast again. And I think I learned something myself as well, and how to better present some of these important processes that we all have to go through when we're dealing with change, either as a leader or as a follower.
And for anyone that wants to learn more, you are a font of knowledge when it comes to leadership and organizational change and behavior. So where can people find out more?
Yeah, so I'm going to be launching my own website very soon. So by the time this podcast goes up, it should be launched. It's going to be johngruda.com. John, Jon, Gruda.com, and it's going to be all the information going to be posted there. And of course, always do feel free to look me up on LinkedIn to connect, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Brilliant. And for anyone that's listening that wants to do that, as soon as it is up, we will pop that link into the show notes, and hopefully we'll get the timing right. So and looking forward to exploring that. So thank you so much, John. And for anyone that's listening that, were there questions I should have asked? What did I do wrong? So feel free to send it through anonymously. Maybe I need a form on my website, but it'd be great to have some feedback. So do reach out either via LinkedIn or via the form on the website. It'd be great to get your questions, and you never know, might be able to drag John on for a third episode. So 3 times a winner.
Oh, sure. Yeah, exactly. There you go. And the same thing with regard to what I was speaking about today. So if you have any feedback on that, do feel free to reach out anytime. And thanks again, Hannah, for having me on. Absolute pleasure. And I look forward to the next time, whenever that might be. Yeah. If that might be. If you'll have me.
Well, it sounds like we have a plan to make a plan to do another episode. So
there you go. We have a plan to make a plan. Thank you, Hannah.